Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was supposed to be asleep when the call came through. It was 2:47, and I'd just finished a grueling week of training exercises at Camp Pendleton. My gear was still scattered across the floor of my barracks, my boots caked in mud. I was dead tired, funny choice of words, looking back. But when the phone rang, I answered out of habit. "Get up, get dressed, we're rolling out in 15, came the voice on the other end. It was Gunnery Sergeant Mills, and he didn't sound happy. I groaned, sitting up, rubbing my eyes. "What's the mission, Gunny?" "Need to know basis, just move." That wasn't unusual. Half the time we weren't told what we were walking into until we were on the bird. But something in his voice, it didn't sit right. 15 minutes later, I was in the armory, checking out my rifle and sidearm. The others were there too, faces tense, quiet. Even the jokers of the unit weren't cracking wise. That was my second clue something was off. We boarded the choppers without a word. No briefing, no details, just coordinates. As we lifted off, I looked down at the base wondering if I'd be back by sunrise. I wasn't. And by sunrise, the world had already started to fall apart. The chopper ride was rough, the air was thick with tension. No one spoke, but you could feel it. That cold, crawling sense that we were flying straight into something bad. Even the pilot kept his chatter to a minimum. The only thing we knew was our destination, a small city about 40 miles inland. It wasn't a training op, and it wasn't a routine deployment. We weren't geared up for overseas, we were loaded for urban combat. That didn't make sense, not then. About 10 minutes out, the radio started crackling. The words were broken and frantic. Requesting evac, multiple, can't contain, then a scream. That's when I felt it. Real fear. And I wasn't the only one. Across from me, Corporal Dwyer was white-knuckling his rifle. Even Staff Sergeant Hensley was scanning the cabin like he expected something to jump us mid-flight. When we finally got eyes on the city, my stomach dropped. Fires burned unchecked. Cars were scattered across the streets like someone had dropped them from the sky. From the air, I could see people running, but some weren't running away. They were charging, swarming in packs. The pilot's voice came through our headsets. "LZ's hot, I repeat, LZ is..." A civilian vehicle burst onto the tarmac we were supposed to land on, followed by a crowd of at least 50 people. At least I thought they were people. Until one of them caught the car's driver, and let's just say that's when I realized something was very wrong. We diverted. The pilot set us down a few blocks away in an industrial zone. The second my boots hit the ground, I felt like I was in a nightmare. There was screaming in the distance, gunfire, and closer to close this low, guttural sound, like animals. "Form up," Gunny Mills barked, and we moved. No one hesitated. We swept the area, but it was already too late for caution. We weren't alone. The first one came out of a warehouse. A man, or what was left of one, covered in blood, eyes wide and empty. He didn't slow down, didn't speak, just ran at us. Hensley shouted a warning, but I was already firing. 2 shots to the chest. He didn't stop. I'll never forget the sound his body made when it hit the ground after the third shot, the one I put through his head. But there were more coming. A lot more. "Move out," Mills shouted. "We need to find survivors." We didn't know it then, but we were already out of time. We moved fast but careful. Our formation was tight, rifles up, eyes scanning every alley, every broken-down vehicle, every shadow. The city was falling apart around us. The smell of smoke and something else clung to the air. something coppery and rotten. We reached a four-way intersection and Gunny Mills raised his fist to signal to halt. We crouched, listening. The sound of gunfire had faded, but there was something else. A distant low murmur, 100 voices moaning at once. "They're close," Hensley muttered, scanning the street. "Eyes up," Mills ordered. "We find survivors, we get answers, and we get out." But there weren't many answers waiting for us. We found the first group in a convenience store, 6 civilians barricaded behind shelves and crates. They were wide-eyed and shaking, and when we entered, they almost started screaming. It took everything Mills had to calm them down. "What happened here?" he asked, but no one had a clear answer. "It had started yesterday," one of them stammered. "People got sick, fever, but then..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. We pushed on. The next few blocks were worse. We saw things I won't describe, things that made hardened Marines go silent. Things that shouldn't happen outside of nightmares. And then we heard the sound of feet, a lot of feet. "Contact left," Dwyer yelled, and they came out of the side street in a wave. Dozens of them, people, but not people. Their eyes were wrong, their faces twisted with rage or hunger, and they didn't slow down. "Open fire," Mills roared. We cut them down, but they didn't stop. Even with bullets tearing through them, they kept coming. Some went down and got back up, dragging shattered limbs as they clawed toward us. It was only headshots that worked. "Fall back," Mills called, and we started moving, but not fast enough. Dwyer was the first to go down. They dragged him screaming into the crowd, and there was nothing we could do. We kept moving, kept firing, but for every one we dropped, more took their place. We were being overrun. And then, just when I thought it was over, we saw the church. Its doors were open, light spilling out. "Go!" Mills shouted, covering our retreat. We ran for that light like it was salvation. We didn't know what waited inside, but we didn't have a choice. We hit the church doors hard, practically falling inside. Hensley and I spun around and slammed them shut, throwing the heavy iron bar across them just as the first of those things crashed against the wood. The whole frame shuddered. The pounding started immediately. Fists, bodies, maybe even heads, slamming into the doors with a strength no human should have had. "Get away from the doors," Mills barked, and we moved back, rifles still trained. But they didn't break through. Not yet. The church was dim, lit by flickering candles and a few battery-powered lanterns. It smelled of wax and old wood, and fear. People were huddled in the pews, at least 24 of them. Their faces were pale, hollow. Some were praying. Others just stared. From the back of the church, a man stepped forward, tall, calm, with a preacher's collar. His eyes were steady, but his hands shook. "Thank God," he whispered when he saw us. I thought no one was coming." Mills stepped forward. "We need information. What happened here?" The preacher nodded, motioning us toward a side room. "Not here. They're already scared enough." We followed him, leaving Hensley and a few others to guard the entrance. The pounding on the doors hadn't stopped, and it was getting louder. In the small office, the preacher closed the door behind us. "It started 3 days ago," he said quietly. "The sickness spread fast. Fevers, aggression, and then they died, but they didn't stay dead." He swallowed hard. "We tried to evacuate, but the roads were blocked. Communications went down. We haven't heard from anyone outside the city since yesterday morning." "What about the police, the National Guard?" Mills asked. The preacher shook his head. "Gone, overrun." The room went cold. Before Mills could respond, there was a crash from the sanctuary, then screaming. We ran back out to find chaos. One of the church's stained glass windows had shattered. They were coming through. "Hold them off," Mills ordered, and we formed a line. The civilians scrambled back as the first of the infected dropped into the room. I squeezed the trigger, and the world became noise and smoke. They kept coming, and we kept firing. The bodies piled up, but the tide wouldn't stop. "We can't stay here," Hensley shouted over the gunfire. "We'll get boxed in." Mills made a call. "Back door, move." We started falling back, trying to keep the civilians together. The preacher led the way. We reached a heavy wooden door at the rear of the church. He fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, and then the doors behind us burst open. "Go! Go!" Mills roared. The night outside was no safer, but at least we weren't trapped, not yet. The night was alive with chaos. As soon as we cleared the back door of the church, the cold air hit me like a slap, but it was the noise that froze me. That awful sound of dozens, maybe hundreds of those things moaning and shrieking somewhere nearby. "Keep moving," Mills barked, and we pushed into the alley behind the church. The civilians were panicked, tripping over each other, and I could hear the infected smashing through the building behind us. We didn't have much time. We reached a small parking lot, and that's when the preacher stopped. "There's a bus," he said, pointing to the far end. It was an old school bus, beaten up but intact. We were going to try to get out, but the driver, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Mills didn't waste a second. "Hensley, check the bus, see if it runs. Dwyer," he stopped himself, jaw tightening. Dwyer was gone. "Santos, cover him." While they moved, the rest of us formed a defensive line. The alley was narrow, good for keeping them bottlenecked, but if they found another way round, we were dead. The preacher was trying to keep the civilians calm, but they were losing it. A woman sobbed into her hands. A man kept whispering, "This isn't happening." I risked a glance back. "Hensley?" He was in the bus, messing with wires under the dashboard. "It's dead," he called back. "Battery's shot." "Fix it," Mills ordered. We heard them before we saw them, those heavy, staggering footsteps. The first one rounded the corner, eyes wild and face bloody. A second followed, then 5, then 10. "Open fire!" The alley exploded with noise. We took them down, but they just kept coming. I shot one in the chest. It barely flinched. Only when I put a round through its head did it drop. "There's too many," Santos yelled. "I'm working on it," Hensley growled from the bus. The engine coughed once, then went silent. I didn't know how many we'd dropped, but it didn't matter. More kept spilling into the alley, and we were running out of ammo. And then the preacher screamed. I spun and saw one of them, no, 2, had gotten through somehow. They were on the civilians. One had tackled a man to the ground. There was blood everywhere. I didn't hesitate. 2 shots, both went down, but the damage was done. "We can't hold this line," Hensley shouted. The bus engine sputtered and roared to life. "Get on," Mills bellowed. It was chaos, civilians scrambling, infected closing in. I covered the rear, firing until my rifle clicked dry. I switched to my sidearm and kept shooting. We got the last civilian on board, and I was right behind them when something hit me from the side. We went down hard. The infected was on top of me, its face inches from mine, teeth snapping. I held it back with one arm and reached for my knife. The gunshot was deafening. The thing's head snapped back and Mills hauled me up. "Move!" We dove onto the bus. The doors slammed shut behind us and Hensley floored it. The infected swarmed after us, but we were already pulling away. For the moment, we'd survived. But the night was far from over. The bus tore through the streets like a battering ram, bouncing over curbs and smashing through abandoned cars. The engine growled like it was ready to die, but it kept going. Outside, the city was collapsing. Fires burned unchecked, and distant screams rose above the noise of the engine. Every shadow seemed alive. Inside, it wasn't much better. The civilians were panicking, sobbing, whispering prayers. Blood streaked the floor, some of it theirs, some of it not. Mills stood at the front, barking into his radio. "This is Echo 2-5. We need evac. We've got civilians and heavy hostile presence." Nothing but static. "We're on our own," Hensley said grimly from the driver's seat. I slid down into one of the bus's battered seats, trying to catch my breath. My hands were still shaking. I could still feel the weight of that thing on top of me, smell its breath, hot, rotten, wrong. "How far's the edge of the city?" I asked. 10 miles, Hensley said. "But the roads are jammed. We'll be lucky if we make it halfway." The preacher came up beside me, his face pale. "You saved us back there," he said quietly. "Thank you." I didn't answer. I didn't feel like a hero, not with Dwyer gone, not with the screams still echoing in my head. A sharp thump against the side of the bus made everyone jump, then another, and another. "They're following us," Santos said. Watching out the window, sure enough they were. Dozens of them, running, stumbling, but keeping pace, and ahead the road was choked with wrecked vehicles. "Brace!" Hensley shouted. The bus hit the first car hard enough to send it spinning. We plowed through, but it slowed us. More of them closed in, clawing at the windows. One threw itself against the glass so hard it cracked. "This isn't gonna hold," Santos yelled. Mills made a decision. We ditched the bus. On my signal, we moved fast and quiet. "Head for that parking garage." He pointed to a structure a block away. We regrouped there. The bus hit one last car, and the engine sputtered and died. "Move!" Mills roared. The doors swung open and we poured out into the street. The infected were on us in seconds. I fired over my shoulder as we ran, trying to buy the civilians time. The preacher led them ahead, while we Marines covered the rear. "Almost there," Hensley called. But then the screaming started again. One of the infected tackled a woman from behind. She went down hard, and in seconds, there was blood. Her husband tried to pull her free, but it was too late. We couldn't save them. We had to keep moving. We hit the parking garage at a dead sprint. Mills and I hauled the metal security gate down behind us. It rattled shut just as the first infected slammed into it. For now, we were safe, but the gate wouldn't hold forever. And the night wasn't over yet. The parking garage was dark and deathly quiet. The only sound our ragged breathing and the distant pounding on the gate behind us. We moved deeper into the structure, the flickering light from the preacher's lantern casting long, shifting shadows. "Third floor," Mills ordered in a low voice. "We'll get a better view and a defensible position." The civilians followed, some crying quietly, others too numb with shock to make a sound. I kept scanning the stairwell, my rifle up. Every creak of concrete, every shifting echo made my heart hammer. We reached the third floor and spread out. The garage overlooked the highway, or what was left of it. A twisted mass of wrecked cars and bodies stretched into the distance. Fires burned in the night, casting everything in a sick orange glow. Hensley joined me at the edge. "No way we're getting out by road." I nodded, jaw tight. "What about air evac? Gunny still trying the radio?" "Yeah, but I wouldn't hold your breath." Behind us, Mills was working the comms, his voice growing more frustrated. "Echo 2-5 requesting immediate evac. Do you read? Anyone?" Static. The preacher came up beside me, his face lined with exhaustion. "This can't be everywhere, can it?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it's bad enough. The civilians were huddled together near the center of the garage, their faces drawn and pale. A little girl clung to her mother, silent tears running down her cheeks. I couldn't look at them for long. The guilt was too heavy. We couldn't save everyone. Suddenly, the radio crackled. Mills froze. Echo 2-5. Repeat, evac. Say again, Mills barked. We need evac. We have civilians. Industrial Park, 5 clicks east, ETA 20 minutes. Mills looked up. We've got a ride. For the first time in hours, hope sparked. But it didn't last long. The sound of metal screeching against concrete echoed through the garage. It came from the lower levels. They're inside, Santos whispered. Move, Mills ordered, keeping his voice low. Stay quiet and stay together. We took the stairs down to the ground floor, every step slow and careful. But the infected weren't known for stealth. The sound of shuffling feet and those awful guttural moans grew louder. We were almost to the exit when they found us. The first one burst out from behind a van, a woman, or what was left of her, arms outstretched and face twisted in rage. She sprinted at us, and Mills dropped her with a single shot, but the sound was like a starting gun. They came from everywhere. Shh, run, Mills roared. The civilians broke first, bolting for the exit. We covered them, laying down fire as the infected poured toward us. My rifle kicked against my shoulder, dropping them one by one, but there were too many. We hit the street, and the preacher led the civilians east. The industrial park was 5 clicks away, 5 clicks through a city that had turned into hell. We ran. Behind us, the infected followed, and the night wasn't over yet. We ran like the devil was at our heels because he was. The infected poured into the street behind us, a wave of rage and hunger. Every time I risked a glance back, they were closer. Faster, Mills barked. His voice strained. The civilians were struggling. The preacher did his best to keep them moving, but they were exhausted, terrified. I wanted to stop, to help them, but slowing down meant death. We're not going to make 5 clicks at this rate, Hensley shouted. He was right. The infected were gaining, and we were running out of road. But then I saw an overpass ahead with a service yard underneath. A chain-link fence surrounded it. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. There, I called out, pointing. We veered toward it, crashing through the gate. Santos and I hauled it shut just as the first infected slammed into it. The whole thing rattled and groaned, but it held for now. Find a way up top, Mills ordered. The yard was full of old construction equipment and shipping containers. We scrambled toward a rusted stairway leading to the overpass above. One by one, the civilians went up, the preacher helping them along. But the fence wouldn't last. It bent and sagged as the infected threw themselves against it. A section started to peel away from the post, and then they were inside. Go, go, I shouted. Santos covered the rear, firing until his rifle clicked dry. He switched to his sidearm, backing toward the stairs. A hand grabbed his shoulder, and then they were on him. No! Hensley moved to help, but Mills stopped him. We can't save him. The last of the civilians made it up. Mills shoved Hensley after them. I covered the stairs, my rounds hitting their marks, but it didn't matter. They just kept coming. Fall back, Mills shouted. We reached the overpass, but there was nowhere left to run. The highway stretched ahead, broken, burning, blocked by wreckage. Behind us, the infected poured up the stairs. This is Echo 2-5, Mills barked into the radio. We need that evac now. 2 minutes out, the voice answered. We didn't have 2 minutes. The infected swarmed onto the overpass. We held the line, our backs to the edge. Every shot counted headshots only. My hands were steady, but my chest burned with exhaustion. "Here they come," Hensley warned. The first infected broke through and then the dam burst. They rushed us in a frenzy. Santos was gone. We were outnumbered, out of ammo, and then the sky thundered. A helicopter swept over the highway, its spotlight cutting through the darkness. A rope ladder unfurled, swinging wildly. "Get the civilians on," Mills ordered. The preacher led them, one by one, up the ladder. Hensley covered them and then he screamed. I turned just in time to see him go down, disappearing beneath the swarm. "Go!" Mills shouted at me. "I'm not leaving you. That's an order, Marine." He fired until his rifle was empty, then pulled his knife. "Get them out of here." I grabbed the ladder. The infected surged forward. Mills went down fighting, his knife flashing, and then they were on him. The ladder swung upward. I climbed, the wind whipping around me. The infected reached, jumped, but we were rising. I didn't stop climbing until hands grabbed me, pulling me into the chopper. The preacher sat near the door, his face streaked with tears. The civilians huddled together, their eyes wide and hollow. Of the Marines, I was the only one left. The city burned below us, the streets swarming with the dead. And as we flew toward whatever safety remained, I knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. The chopper thundered through the night sky, but there was no comfort in the sound. The city below burned like a vision of hell, fires raging, streets swarming with the dead. Every so often, I'd catch flashes of movement, people still fighting, still running, but there weren't many. Inside the helicopter, it was dead silent. The civilians, the ones we managed to save, huddled together, too shocked to speak. The preacher sat near the open door, his eyes on the city below, his hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. I couldn't tell if he was praying or just holding on. Mills, Hensley, Santos, Dwyer. Their faces kept flashing through my mind. We left them down there. We didn't have a choice, but that didn't make it any easier. The pilot's voice crackled over the headset. "We're 20 clicks out from the industrial park. Evac site still secure, but command's radio silent. Something's not right." "Nothing's right," I muttered. The preacher finally spoke. "What happens now?" I didn't have an answer. The chopper banked east, and the industrial park came into view, a cluster of warehouses and open lots, ringed by a high fence. At first, it looked clear, but as we descended, I saw the vehicles. Military, abandoned. "This isn't good," the pilot said. We touched down in an empty lot. The civilians climbed out first, led by the preacher. I followed, rifle up, scanning the shadows. The whole place was silent. Too silent. Mills always said quiet was the worst sound of all. "Stay close," I told the group, "and stay quiet." The industrial park was a maze of shipping containers and darkened buildings. The wind rattled loose metal and whipped the smell of smoke through the air. We found the military vehicles, Humvees and transports, but no signs of life. "Where's the evac?" the preacher whispered. The radio on my vest crackled. "Echo 25, do you copy? This is Foxtrot Actual. We're inbound to the industrial park." The rest of the message dissolved into static, but they were coming. We just had to hold out a little longer. A sound echoed through the lot, a soft, dragging shuffle. It came from the nearest warehouse. The civilians froze. My blood turned cold. "Stay here," I ordered. The preacher grabbed my arm. "Don't go alone." I shook him off and moved toward the sound. The warehouse doors were open just enough for someone to slip inside. I raised my rifle and stepped through. The darkness swallowed me whole. My flashlight cut a narrow path through the gloom, sweeping over crates and equipment. The smell hit me first blood, thick and coppery. And then I heard breathing. Fast, ragged, human. I turned the corner and found a soldier slumped against the wall, his uniform soaked in blood. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy. "Help," he whispered. I knelt beside him. "Where's your unit?" "Gone," he croaked. We were overrun. They never stopped, never." His breath hitched. "You have to go. They're coming." A sound rose outside, distant at first. A low moan that built into a chorus of hunger. The dead had found us. I hauled the soldier up, half carrying him back toward the entrance. We burst into the lot just as the infected poured in, a tide of bodies spilling through the broken fence and between the shipping containers. "Run!" I shouted. The preacher led the civilians toward the far end of the lot, where a flatbed truck sat with its engine still idling. I covered them, firing into the swarm. My rifle kicked and roared, but for every one that fell, 3 more took its place. The soldier sagged against me, too weak to stand. "Leave me," he gasped. "Not happening," I growled. We reached the truck. The preacher and the others were already piling into the back. I pushed the soldier up, then climbed after him. "Go!" I shouted at the driver, one of the civilians, a mechanic. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the dirt. The infected chased us, some fast enough to keep pace. One clawed at the side of the flatbed and the preacher kicked it off. Ahead, the fence loomed. The driver gunned it, and we smashed through, metal screaming as the barrier crumpled. We hit the road hard, but we were clear, for the moment. The soldier coughed, his eyes already glazing over. "It's everywhere," he whispered. "No safe zones. No evac. It's too late." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, but the city burning behind us said otherwise. The radio crackled again. "Foxtrot actual, hold your position." "Repeat hold." But there was no position left to hold. The night wasn't over, and nowhere was safe. The road stretched ahead, empty and broken. Fires flickered on the horizon, casting long, dancing shadows. Behind us, the city was a smoldering ruin, and the infected were still coming. We could see them in the rearview mirror, a dark mass in the distance, relentless and tireless. The flatbed truck rattled over the cracked asphalt. The engine whined, pushed to its limit, but I didn't tell the driver to slow down. We couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Maybe not ever. The soldier we'd pulled from the warehouse lay in the back, his breathing shallow and ragged. Blood soaked his uniform, too much blood. The preacher knelt beside him, whispering words of comfort, but we both knew how this would end. "You have to listen," the soldier rasped, his hand weakly grabbing my sleeve. His eyes were glassy, his skin clammy. "It's not just the city, it's everywhere." "Everywhere?" I echoed, my stomach dropping. He nodded barely. The bases fell first. They didn't tell anyone, it spread too fast. No safe zones, no evac. It's all gone." The words hit like a punch. I wanted to argue, but the truth was already written across the burning skyline. His grip loosened. "You have to find higher ground. Stay away from the cities. They follow the noise." Then his hand slipped away, and he went still. The preacher closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, but I didn't have time for grief. "Where are we going?" one of the civilians asked. A young woman, eyes wide, voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. "We keep moving," the preacher said softly. "We survive." The radio crackled again, broken, distorted, but one word cut through the static. "Sanctuary." The driver's head snapped toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" "Where?" I demanded, grabbing the radio. "Say again. Where's the sanctuary?" More static. Then, northeast, mountains. Follow the river. The voice cut out, but it was enough. We had a heading. Turn north, I told the driver. Follow the river if we find one. We keep going until we see those mountains. As the truck rumbled on, the preacher sat beside me. Do you think it's real? I don't know, I admitted, but it's hope. The hours blurred together. We drove until the fuel gauge dipped toward empty. The infected never stopped following a dark line on the horizon, always there. The night passed into a gray, sickly dawn, and still we drove. Eventually, the road turned to dirt, and the city faded behind us. Trees rose up, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air smelled clean. The river appeared beside us, winding east toward the mountains. And that's when we saw it. Smoke, not from fires, but from chimneys, rising in thin, steady columns from a cluster of buildings nestled in the foothills. Sanctuary, the preacher whispered. We didn't know what waited for us there. Salvation, or more death, but we didn't have a choice. We drove toward the smoke, hoping the end of one nightmare would be the beginning of something better. But deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.